Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. Now, I know in our last episode, we said we would be starting our Masters of the Air review series. However, I think it would be better suited for slightly further down the road. I'll explain why. Our next two episodes are going to focus solely on two things. One of them being the importance of this weekend, that being Memorial Day here in the United States. And then in 2 weeks, the world will celebrate the 80th anniversary of D Day, marking its official liberation of Eastern Europe. These episodes will be pretty short in comparison to some of our widely acknowledged series and episodes. They're incredibly important, not just to the subject matter, but for the history of our modern culture. And today, we're also going to learn a little bit more about me and what this weekend means to me and my family. It's incredibly important as right now, my home is decorated with the most beautiful of red poppies, and that's thanks to my loving wife, Taylor. I am not going to do a This Week in 44 as we know exactly what was going on this week in 1944. Eisenhower and the rest of the Supreme Allied Command sat anxiously, silently, waiting as each day passed. They'd prepared, practiced, and exercised as much as they could. Paratroopers doing hundreds of practice jumps, pilots learning how to fly basically until they could do it with their eyes closed, and naval vessels were prepared to move the largest amphibious invasion force the history had ever seen. And this was all to bring the fighting men of the United States, England, and Canada across the British Channel to begin the liberation of Europe. And this would be the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in some aspects, but we're going to cover that on the D-Day episode. But now let's pop out our Star Spangled Banner, right? Let's get together with those that we love. And when we drive past the cemetery this weekend and you see those flags waving next to the small white tombstones, crosses, and stars of David, remember why we are still here. Because young men made the choice to stay eternally young, dying in a faraway land. This is our Memorial Day episode. Now, for those of you that maybe are not American or maybe you simply do not understand what Memorial Day is, I'll give you a brief history, right? It is a federal holiday here in the United States honoring and remembering all of those that have died during wartime service. Now, this can be everything from being killed in direct combat or a death during a support of an operation. Traditionally, this holiday was celebrated on the 30th of May every single year. However, that did change in 1971 when it became the last Monday in May. Now, this holiday was originally celebrated the first time in 1868 as a remembrance of all of the Union soldiers that would be killed in the American Civil War. But the two world wars would dramatically change this holiday in the United States. After the First World War, during the 1 year that the Americans were involved and fought in, over 116,000 Americans would die. At this time, this was the largest death toll of American soldiers fighting on foreign soil. But it is the remembrance of those who died in World War I is the first time that we see the now known famous red poppies that are forever linked to such a remembrance. Well, we got to ask, how did we even get there? Where did these poppies come from? And it's during the first full year of World War One, the Second Battle of Ypres would take place from the 22nd of April 1915 to the 25th of May. Now, I may be pronouncing that wrong. I think it's Ypres. I could be wrong. Anyway, and it was fought bitterly between the United Kingdom and France, uh, working together against the German Empire. So, quite literally, it's a battle that spanned 1 month in Belgium, And it is estimated that in this month, nearly 100,000 men from both sides combined would eventually fall, creating one of the largest battlefield cemeteries in history. A Canadian Army physician by the name of Dr. John McCrae would attend many of these funerals, and it was here that he noticed rows and rows of red poppies between each headstone, a field of men forever covered in red poppies. McCrae would be inspired to write a bit of poetry behind the moment, and as we now know, in Flanders Field. At the end of this podcast episode, I will end it with that full poem. But it is here that not just the men, but the world began to connect the mass loss of life with these singular red flowers. By 1920 in the United States, the Department of Veteran Affairs and the American Legion would officially make the red poppy the symbolic gesture that we know it as today in our culture. But the United States nor the world realized that in less than 30 years, they would again be at war in Europe, and this time they would add the Pacific. And it would only generate the single greatest loss of life in wartime period. By the end of 1945, over 405,000 Americans would be buried in battlefields over across the globe. And in the United States, year over year, the remembrance of those being killed would be raised. And in 1944, two operations would take place that in just a span of 6 months, 59,000 Americans would be killed in Eastern Europe. The first being the Battle of Normandy, with nearly 30,000 men being killed in the ensuing 2 month operation that started on June 6th. That December, as the Americans were inching closer and closer to Germany, the Nazis would unleash a last ditch effort to push the Americans and the rest of the Western Allies out of Belgium. That's ironic. Again, Belgium, and they were going to push them back to France. And that would be the Battle of the Bulge, and it would take the lives of nearly 20,000 Americans in just a single month. That following year, as the Americans pushed further into Central Europe, an additional 15,000 would die. And there are hundreds of battles taking place within these large operations, right? The very first series that we did in this podcast was over the Battle of the Hurricane, where 12,000 Americans would perish. In the Pacific, 13,000 would die in the Philippines, and 12,000 would be killed in the 82 days of fighting on Okinawa. From 1944 to the end of the war in 1945, it seemed like the war was quickly becoming a death factory for American men. And let's not forget the bomber crews and pilots being shot from the sky and Navy vessels being sent to the bottom of the ocean. Battlefield cemeteries all around the world were now popping up with thousands of young Americans under white stones. But unfortunately, the wartime deaths would never truly end. There's anything that the United States is good at, or rather known for, it is either being at war or preparing or supplying for war. Less than 10 years after the Second World War, nearly 37,000 Americans would be killed in the 3 years of fighting during the Korean War. From 1961 to 1975, over 58,000 Americans would perish in Vietnam. Skirmishes and operations in Panama, Somalia, Grenada, and other places would see men and women killed wearing an American uniform. And now we're on to the part that is rather close and hits home to me. That red poppy means in my home. I know I've been mentioned in the past, but myself enlisted in the United States Air Force during my junior year of high school, the age of 17. The entire reason behind that was because during that time, our nation was again at war in the global war on terror. I grew up seeing the military funerals and those fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And every Memorial Day, the events got larger and more personal. Over the course of that conflict, nearly 7,000 Americans would die in direct combat, with nearly triple dying in support of those operations. One of those being a senior airman, Vincent Sanchez, that I wear on my arm every single day. A dear friend of mine who lost his life at an incredibly young age. Being in security forces in the U.S. Air Force, we were always aware of the chances of what could happen and you might lose your life. Many defenders before us had went and gave their life. Memorial Day for me is remembering those defenders that went before me and gave their ultimate sacrifice. The red poppies that blow in front of my home are a reminder to me every day to be thankful for being able to do what I can do. On Monday, with it being Memorial Day, I will load up my old bag with a flag flying above. I will march my happy ass 14 miles to a cemetery nearby that has those beautiful rows of American flags flying in front of rows and rows of white tombstones. This year will be the first year that my son Carson joins me in a remembrance walk. For the rest of you, though, take that time. Send a small prayer, maybe. Go hang out with friends. Drink an ice cold beer. And hell, if you need to, because I know I will, cry. The purpose of Memorial Day is to remember and reflect on those who shall never grow old, who gave their innocence and their youth to fight and protect. Whatever you do this weekend, just remember. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode. Make sure you leave us a rating and a review wherever you listen to our show. Hit us up on all the social media sites by searching World on Fire, a history of the Second World War podcast. In our next episode, we will be doing a run up of the Normandy invasion and the 80th anniversary. Also, on June 6th, if you're in the Indianapolis area, I will be presenting at the Hamilton East Public Library at 6:30 discussing said 80th anniversary and what it meant for the people back at home. And like I said, before we end this podcast, in Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, through poppies grow in Flanders fields.